Life Audio.
Hello, and welcome to the Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic podcast. I am your host, John Seidel. This is your home for real stories, radical vulnerability, and remarkable comebacks. In the end, this podcast is a place for the desperate, the downtrodden, the destitute, and especially the drunk. But it's also a place of hope and healing. I know that firsthand because I'm the Christian who became an alcoholic, not the other way around. Today, I've found sobriety after decades of struggling. But more importantly than finding sobriety, I found Jesus. My prayer is that as I interview people just like you and just like me, along with professionals in the fields of trauma, faith, and addiction recovery, you will find the peace that is available to you through Christ on the other side of whatever you're going through and whatever addiction that might be. Because let's face it, we're all addicted to something. So welcome. Let's get radically vulnerable as we explore what it looks like to be on this journey of messy sanctification. If you change your mind, can you change your habits? And if you can change your habits by changing your mind, can you, in a way, think yourself out of addiction? Now, that's kind of a provocative question, and I wouldn't necessarily say the blanket answer is yes. But our next guest, our guest today, Dr. Lee Warren, is really the foremost expert on marrying faith and thinking in order to change your life. Now, listen, if you follow me on social media, if you follow my writing, you know that I am wholly and 100% against kind of this moral therapeutic deism that says that basically is what I call TED Talk Christianity. That's not what this is, right? Dr. Lee Warren is not some gimmicky guy who's saying, if you just think positive thoughts and manifest, you can manifest whatever you want. No, this guy is a actual brain surgeon. He's a neurosurgeon who has gone through trials and tribulations in his life, losing his son in a tragic way, which he will talk about today, being a surgeon in a war zone in the Iraq and Afghanistan era, and he has put together what he calls self-brain surgery, and it's a way to again marry faith and science to really make a difference in your day-to-day life. And so I am really excited to talk to Dr. Lee Warren. He's become a friend. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But man, this guy, he has a heart for people and for helping people. His story and what he's gone through to get where he is incredible. And so really please enjoy this episode today. Without further ado, Dr. Lee Warren on the Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic podcast. Dr. Lee, thank you so much for joining the Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic podcast. We prayed a little bit before this, and it really is true. I prayed. I just thank the Lord that, especially when I was in the depths of my addiction, it was unclear to me how life could ever look different, right? And I think that's one of the lies that the enemy tells us. And so the fact that I'm here with you, it just blows me away. I mean, this is a relationship that, 18 months ago, 2 years, I mean, even I guess maybe 6 months ago is kind of when it started, but just could have never imagined. So it's just a remnant of God's grace. So thank you for being here.
Absolutely, John. It's an honor.
And I think, there's so much I want to talk to you about. I'm sure we won't get to it all, and so we'll probably have to have you come on again because that's just how it is. But
absolutely.
I want to talk about a few things, and I think where I want to start is a little bit with your story. And while we have people generally share their stories, you're not someone who yourself has struggled in the mental health space or with necessarily or with addiction, although you have just a great story from, in a sense, being over overseas and being in the military, and then you have the story of your son. And so I'd love for you to just kind of walk us through that story.
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in a Christian home and, raised by Bible-believing parents and had all the boxes checked, right? Undergrad at a Christian college and all of that. And then I went to medical school on a scholarship from the Air Force. So thank you, taxpayers, for putting me through med school. But I was one of those kids that my version of Christianity was very, I don't want to say fundamentalist, but legalistic for sure. Do the right thing, always do your best and do everything, and God will take care of you and all that kind of stuff was my background. And then I became sort of down that stream of thought. One of our things that our tradition did was encourage young people to marry very early, which I did. And I had a really difficult first marriage as I dealt with going to medical school and going to the military. And as you might imagine, learning how to be a neurosurgeon kind of turns people into control freaks a little bit. And so I became very controlled. I valued being able to control everything in my environment, including my operating room, my home, everything. And so I went to Iraq in the end of 2004. In 2005, I got deployed to the Iraq War and did about 200 brain surgeries in a tent hospital. We treated Americans and coalition soldiers and terrorists and insurgents and everybody, Iraqi civilians and babies. And the base I was at was called Balad Air Base, and at the time was the most attacked base. We were mortared or rocketed essentially every day. So I survived over 100 mortar attacks while I was there. And the turning point really of that experience was right before I went to war, literally a month before. My grandfather died, my brother had a stroke and nearly died, and then my first marriage was on life support by the time I deployed. So when I left for war, I commented to a colleague that I felt like I'd already been at war for a long time. It felt like everything I knew and everything I thought I understood was kind of falling apart. And while I was in Iraq, there was a day when I was outside going from my quarters to this place called the BX, which is where you can go buy shampoo and, stuff, like a little mini Walmart that every base has. And I decided to take a shortcut across the base, and I wasn't wearing my protective gear that day. I had on running gear. I was going to go work out. And about halfway across there in this very open part of the base, we had an alarm red, which means the mortars were coming. And I got caught outside, John, in the middle of a mortar attack, and I didn't have any place to go. I wasn't close to a bunker or any place safe. So there was a little concrete wall, and I just basically huddled up against it for about an hour while the bombs landed and the sirens went off and all that. And basically it felt like every time something blew up, God was teaching me that I really did not have control of any part of my life that I thought I had control of. And, my marriage, my family, my relationship with my kids, all those things, my ability to control what happened in the operating room. Like God was basically saying, hey, I could take everything from you right now, or, you can learn how to trust me. And so that was the beginning of this sort of release of the idea that I had any control over my life. And then fast forward, got home from the war, went through a divorce, moved from Texas to Alabama because my kids had moved while I was deployed to try to be closer to my children. And then as the years went by, met and married Lisa and remarried, and then blended two families together and spent all this time sort of trying to put my life back together after all that stuff had happened. And then in about 2010, so 5 years after I got home from the war, I had a full-blown, out-of-nowhere PTSD episode. I had never, literally came home from the war and put everything that I brought home, my uniforms and any souvenirs and some shrapnel I'd removed from brains and things, had put them in a trunk in my garage and just never dealt with that because I was so busy, getting my family back on track and getting my career back on track and moving and getting remarrying and all that stuff for years. And I just never dealt with what happened in the war. And so when the nightmares started and I started having flashbacks and all those problems, I thought I was going crazy. Lisa said, hey, you ought to go out and unpack that trunk and tell us your stories, and you ought to maybe write about it and and talk about what happened. And I didn't listen to her. kept having nightmares. And finally, I went and talked to a friend of mine at the hospital who was a psychiatrist. And I said, hey, I've got this friend who had this real traumatic experience. I laid the whole thing out, third party. And he said, well, what that guy ought to do, Lee, is go out and unpack that trunk, and he ought to write about it and tell his stories and all that stuff. And so he basically said everything Lisa had already said.
Yeah.
And so I did. I took her out in the garage, and we started unpacking things. And I remembered that I had a thumb drive in that trunk, and we found it. And on that thumb drive were digital photographs, about 5,000 of them that I had taken while I was deployed, of all these patients I'd operated on and all this stuff and, carnage and what it looked like to be on the base and everything. And of all the soldiers that I took care of, we hardly ever knew their names, because we would stabilize them and put them on a C-130 or C-17 and fly them out to go back to the States. And so we just sort of did battlefield medicine and never really knew who we were taking care of. But in all those digital files, there was one file that had a name on it. And the name was Paul Statzer, the sergeant. And so I opened that file up and was showing Lisa, and I remembered this guy. He was the most injured person I'd ever seen, and 5 of us operated on him at the same time. He had brain injury, ophthalmologic injury, he had a trachea perforation and a jugular vein tear and a whole bunch of orthopedic trauma. And so a bunch of surgeons operated on him at the same time and got him stable enough to put him on the airplane. And Lisa said, well, what do you think happened to that guy? And I said, well, I'm sure he died. I mean, he was just devastated. His injuries were horrible. And she said, well, we have his name. Let's Google and see if we can find anything out about him. And lo and behold, he was on CBS Evening News, walking and talking. He still had his head deformed. They hadn't finished his reconstruction from all the bone he lost in his head. And this guy was alive and well and conversing and had made a really amazing recovery. And so we reached out, and I was able to connect with them. And we ended up flying to Pittsburgh, and I hugged a guy that I took care of in the war, and his mom and dad, thanked me for saving his life. And he's working, he's got a job, he can ride a motorcycle. He's really made an amazing recovery. Wow. And that closed some loop, I think, of did anything that I did over there matter? Did anybody survive? Did it make a difference that I was there? And all that stuff kind of closed when I met Paul. And I wrote that first book, No Place to Hide, was my first book that I wrote about all that whole experience of recovery and going through all that stuff. And so we had just kind of gotten our life back together and gotten all that under control. And I had sold my first manuscript to Zondervan. No Place to Hide was going to come out in the spring of 2014. And in the fall of 2013, our son Mitchell, who was 19 at the time, was stabbed to death and died. And the way that it played out was that he and his best friend were both stabbed and both died in the same house, and they never really figured out what happened. There was a lot of controversy, and some of the police thought maybe Mitch had killed his friend and then killed himself, but he had 8 stab wounds in his neck, and there were 3 knives in the house that had blood on them in all different rooms. And so it was just this crazy thing, and the small town police in Alabama just closed it down and cleaned the crime scene and said this was a murder-suicide and went on their way. And we couldn't sort of wrap our heads around how that could have been possible for a number of reasons, but primarily because Mitch and his friend were best friends since birth, since they were little kids, and there was no substances in their blood, there were no alcohol, no drugs, nothing involved. So it just didn't make any sense that there would have been some kind of conflict between them that would have resulted in that kind of injury. So basically we were handed this devastating loss of a child without any explanation for it. And again, I was unable to control that event of what happened to my son. Am I ever going to be able to find that out? And so that set us on a path of not just kind of having to make peace with not knowing what happened, but also how do you put your life back together when my background had been that God will take care of you if you always do the right thing. And Here I kept having these events where he didn't take care of me. I get blown up and my brain got bombarded and my marriage failed and now my son's died and all that. So it really shook my faith. And so around the same time as I was dealing with all that, I had in my professional career as a neurosurgeon, kept running into patients who had this particular brain tumor called glioblastoma, which is a high-grade brain cancer. And basically everybody dies. If you get that diagnosis, the 5-year survival is like 1 in 10,000. Like it's just almost nobody survives it. And so I kept running into people, and I would see this diagnosis, I would look at the scan and see the tumor, and in my mind, I could predict what was going to happen to that person and when it was going to happen. I would say, I've seen the end of you. I know exactly when you're going to get sick and when you're going to stop eating and when your hair's going to fall out, and when you're going to die. And I would just forecast that in my mind. And it conflicted inside me because I was supposed to believe in prayer and in hope and in encouraging people to hold on and fight and all that stuff as a good doctor. But as a Christian also, I couldn't reconcile how to tell someone to keep fighting, because I knew the importance of hope, right? While I already thought in my heart that I knew what was going to happen. And so I was trying to work on that, and I was writing a book about that when Mitch died. And I went from sort of trying to explain to other people how to handle hardship to being in the middle of it. And so that was the second major sort of trauma, as you said, mental health crisis for me, was everything I thought I knew about God, about family, about faith, turned out not to be accurate or true. And so how do you process what happens when the things you think you know don't turn out to be true? So how do you hold on? And my life had always been, I turned to God when I was struggling, and here it felt like he kept turning away from me. Mm-hmm. And so Lisa and I, again, after we lost Mitch, spent several years trying to put our faith back together and keep our family together. We had 4 other children that were still alive. One still at home with us, Kaylin, who was a junior in high school when her brother died. And so we spent a couple of years trying to find our way back. And for me, it turned around when I saw with my own eyes the direct evidence of neuroplasticity in Auburn, Alabama, where we lived at the time. We lived in Auburn and worked. Our practice was on the 3rd floor of an MRI research center where we had something called a functional MRI scanner. And functional imaging is regular imaging is where you take a picture of an arm or a skull and you see that thing. You see the image of the organ that you imaged. But functional imaging, you can see what the organ does. And so with functional imaging, you can see what happens in your brain when you think something, or when you move your arm, or when you move your toe. You can see different areas of the brain getting involved. And you can literally, with your eyes, see what happens to the brain in response to your action or your thought. And so we were about a month after losing Mitch and went back to work. And shortly after we went back to work, we had a meeting down in the MRI Research Center. And the guys were doing research in the functional scanner, and we got to watch this happen. And they said, okay, Mrs. Johnson in the scanner, move your right arm. And she would move her arm, and we would see the brain light up. When the brain lights up on that scan, it means that there's blood flow going to some area of the brain that controls that thing that the person's doing. And that was pretty neat. You could see an arm and what happens in the brain when the arm moves. And then they would say, okay, well, tell us about the worst thing you've ever experienced, Mrs. Johnson. Think about, not tell us, but think about the worst day of your life, the day your husband died, the day you found out your breast cancer had returned, your child was stillborn, whatever it was. Mm. And you would see that person being instructed to think about something and then thinking about it and seeing different parts of their brain light up, the fear centers and the amygdala and all the areas involved in emotional reaction to things. And then you would see their vital sign monitors change, and their heart rate would go up, and their blood pressure would go up, and their respiratory rate would go up. And we were seeing, basically, you think about something and your brain does something and then your body does something, right? And then they would say, okay, stop thinking about that bad thing and now think about the best day of your whole life, the day he proposed, the day your child was born, the day you got that award at work or whatever, the day your book came out, whatever it was. What is the best thing that ever happened? And all of a sudden in the brain, all these other parts would light up and different neurochemical things were happening, and the vital signs would change. The heart rate comes down, the blood pressure comes down, everything gets better physiologically. And Lisa turned and said, that's Philippians 4. We're seeing when you think about something, you become less anxious. When you choose to think about a better thought, you have a better outcome. We're seeing that people really can change their life by changing their mind. And the more I thought about that, I realized as time went on that process of choosing what you think about, making structural changes in your brain that activates genes and changes your physiology, that's exactly what I do in the operating room of surgery. It's real surgery. Like you can change the structure of your brain in real time by thinking about one thing and not another thing. And it's actually not a metaphor. It's a mechanism of how you can physically change your brain and make your life better. And so then after that, it was a race to putting our hearts and our minds and our lives back together by understanding all the different places in Scripture where God tells us to think about this and not that, and our life will flourish instead of flounder. And so that's kind of the nutshell version of what got me to I think what we're going to talk about today.
We'll be right back after this. Ooh, I thought I knew the story. I think I was wrong on some aspects. And it's way better than I even remembered or thought it was. Like, holy cow. Wow. First of all, as someone I haven't lost a child, but I've lost a sister, I've lost a father, I understand, especially tragically, right?
Yeah.
Not from, in a sense, the most natural of causes, a car accident, a stroke, the other one.
Sorry.
And I can empathize with you there. And I guess that probably leads me here. I think there's so many of us, when I kind of started getting curious about why I was drinking and really started, uncovering some of those things that I had suppressed and pushed down or said I'm not going to deal with, or I don't really want to talk about, or that doesn't really affect me. When I finally started rooting those out, freedom really became possible.
Yeah.
And I guess my question to you is, as someone who didn't turn to substances, right, what do you credit that to? Because I think there's a lot of us, and there's a lot of people who are listening here who are like, well, I did turn to substances. What do you think it was in your life that even, I'm not saying you dealt with everything in the most healthy way, but at least you didn't do X, right? What do you credit that to?
Well, I think first of all, just to be transparent, I think we tried everything. I mean, I would drink a glass of wine or have some bourbon, and the next day I would not feel good, and I would still feel sad about losing Mitch, and then also have a headache, or then also not remember what I needed to talk to Lisa about the next day or whatever. So I tried a number of surrogates, including getting really in shape, or doing, working extra hard and doing more surgeries, or trying to write all the time, or trying to redeem myself in some way. And I just found that this principle for me was that anesthesia is great in the operating room, but it's terrible when you're trying to change your mind, because it leaves you with what we call a tomorrow tax the next day. Like you always end up paying the price of whatever you did the night before, and still have the other problem that's bigger or more magnified now because you didn't manage it appropriately. So I think I did try a number of things, but I just kept finding myself worse off the next day. And I guess there was the other piece of it was professionally, I'm on call so much that I couldn't do certain things to take my brain off of it, or I would miss a phone call or something. So I think I'm not telling that story just to say, look how much more healthy I managed my trauma than you did. No. It's just that it was very clear to me that if I didn't figure out the source of what was really going on, I could endlessly cover it with a number of other things, and it would never get better. And so I think that was the sort of principle for me was, how do we put our minds back together in a way that handles this tragic loss that we've suffered, and still allows us to move forward, because we still have other kids. We our first grandchild was born on the day Mitch was buried, and we had this conflict between beauty and new birth and loss and pain and all that, and so we credit our granddaughter Scarlett actually for helping us stay in between the rails, because we had something to live for, some light, they were happening at the same time. So I think that's it. It's just finding a way to really examine yourself and see what it is that you're getting out of the response that you've chosen to take when you're hurting, and being sort of introspective enough to say, is this particular behavior helping me in my goal towards getting better, or is it not? And for us, that was kind of the thing. We couldn't find a surrogate that worked. And so we just finally decided that no surrogate was going to work. And so we decided to press in and see what God could do for us.
You talked about getting to the root, and maybe just simply how would you categorize what was at your root?
I think it's anytime you've gone through major loss, and I think perhaps especially the loss of a child, because it's such a unique Everybody expects to lose their parents. Everybody expects that either they or their spouse will pass away first. And everybody kind of expects that. But for some reason, none of us expect to lose a child. There are parts of the world, like when I was in Iraq, where every parent knows that one or more of their kids is probably going to die before they do. They just routinely lose kids, and at birth or in childhood from some disease or some trauma or bomb goes off. But in America, at least, in most of the new world, I think we expect our kids to outlive us, and it never joins our paradigm that we might lose a child. And for me, it was kind of ridiculously naive because I'm in a job where I commonly have to tell people that their kid didn't make it. The kid hit his head because he wasn't wearing a helmet when he fell off his bike, or wasn't wearing a seatbelt when he was driving, or whatever. I'm the guy that gives you that news in the ER all the time that you've lost your son or lost your daughter. And so I was around it all the time, so I should have considered myself possible for that outcome. But also my brother lost a child when he was driving on Father's Day, hit a puddle of water, and they hydroplaned and rolled, and one of his triplets was killed when they were 8, when my nephew Jonathan was 8. And so Jonathan's his brother. So for me, I was naive enough to think that it would never happen to me. And so the problem then became, I'd gone through this thing that I thought I was immune to somehow, crazily. And that made me question God and his love for me, and if he even was real. I went through the whole theodicy thing. Is why does God allow suffering, and why could this happen? And I did everything right. Why am I suffering in such a way? And I think the bottom line at the end of it turned out to be something I read from Viktor Frankl, which I always kind of chuckle because every time we have a podcast, somebody brings up Viktor Frankl, right? Anytime you're talking about hardship. But it's true. What he said, suffering stops being suffering when you find a purpose in it or find meaning in it. Mm-hmm. And so for us, it was going to consume us that we had lost our son, or we were going to have to find some way to give that purpose. And as it turned out, about 6 months, for the first 6 months or so after Mitch died, I started not knowing how to help my kids, and I started emailing all of my other 4 children every morning, and something encouraging, so a Bible verse or something I wanted them to think about that day. And those emails started getting forwarded around to other family members, and by January or so, he died in August, lots of people were reading those daily emails, and I just realized I had this ability or maybe calling to encourage other people even while I was hurting. And so that at some point turned into a blog and turned into a podcast. I'm still doing 13 years, 12 years later now, still writing every day or podcasting to people. And that turned into this ministry that led to these other books that I wrote and all that stuff. And what I figured out was that I had turned Mitch's loss away from being what we had lost to being grateful for what he was, and that I could use the story of how our lives were bettered by his to make sure that he has a legacy of helping other people. And so that kind of lost to legacy shift, as I call it, gave purpose to the pain that we had. And amazingly, and I'm sure you've experienced this already, but people commonly reach out to me and they say, hey, I was considering suicide, or hey, I was, had really gone overboard with alcohol until I heard your story, and you put words to something that I felt, but I didn't know how to say it. And so that ability that Mitch's, that sort of understanding that Mitch's life today in 2025 is helping other people, means that his loss wasn't just a senseless tragedy, but that it can be used for the purpose of helping other people. Then that gives it some meaning. And so Frankl's right. When you find a way to give it purpose, it stops being just suffering. So I think the root of it is understanding that everything we go through, if God allows it, he can redeem it. If God said to Isaiah, forget where it is, 43 maybe, that I've refined you in the furnace of suffering. I have refined you in the furnace of suffering. And so I said, well, I can either be defined or refined. So I can become the person, and this person, there's somebody, if you see them on the street today and their kid died 20 years ago, and you say, hey, John, how's it going? They'll say, well, I'm really suffering. I'm thinking about my son. And they're still carrying that thing that happened, and it became the thing that their whole life was defined by.
Yeah.
And if you can let it refine you instead, then 20 years later, you can be the guy who they say, oh, you went through this devastating thing. You turn it into this ministry and you're helping people all over the world. And your son would be really proud of you. And the first time somebody says that to you, you're like, I hope he's proud of me. And that I want him to be proud of me. I want him to know that his life is still impacting people today, even though he's been gone for over a decade, right?
Wow. It's so crazy to hear you say some of that stuff because, it's what I talk about a little bit in my first book, The Proper Theology of Suffering.
Yeah.
And I think I talk about it in my first book, and I think I thought I understood it, and I did, right? In talking about how my mental health has been used for my good and God's glory, right? And so all of that stuff is still true, and yet what I realize now in writing my second book and then after that becoming an alcoholic is I didn't realize how true it was. Right? Or I thought it was just going to be around mental health and anxiety and OCD, and yet God was like, yeah, that was just kind of like paving the way. So you understood what I could do with this even greater, mess, if you will. Yeah. All right, so I want to go into you had kind of teed it up, but I had to go back and just kind of talk about some of that stuff of neuroplasticity. Yeah. And the brain regenerating itself. It's funny, maybe not haha, but as someone with anxiety and OCD, one of my ruminations, especially when untreated, can be about health stuff, right? On more than one occasion, I'm like, I know I'm going to die of cancer. It's just going to happen. And I remember, my journey with alcohol is not, I got drunk at 13 and then continued to get drunk, until I finally gave it up. I did get drunk at 13, but for the most part, I didn't really drink until 21. And I remember part of that was driven by, I saw this study, I saw this article that says when you drink, you kill brain cells. And I said, I don't want to be dumb, right? Like, right. And that may sound ridiculous, but as someone who has OCD, you think about some certain things and they just stick with you. Yeah. And so that actually kept me from drinking a little bit. And I say all that to set up that once I finally did give myself over to alcohol, I really did have this underlying fear of like, I've drank myself into stupidity, you know, like I've killed so many brain cells. Right. And now when I gave it up, I was like, hey, I'm just going to give that to the Lord. But then you come along with this explanation and talking about neuroplasticity and how the brain can, regenerate and rebuild itself. I mean, that's my take. You'll give the more scientific. But talk about neuroplasticity, and I think especially for people listening who feel like maybe they've done unimaginable damage and there's no hope, which sometimes can lead us to say, well, I'm pot committed. I've already done the damage. I'm just going to keep going, right?
That's exactly right.
So talk about that aspect of neuroplasticity in the brain.
Well, I think the first thing is you got to go back about 300 years to Isaac Newton, who was the first guy, who was a Christian, by the way, who was the first guy to kind of say, hey, we can understand the universe by breaking it down to its component parts. And we understand what the parts are, then we can reverse engineer it and figure out how it's going to behave and perform. And he didn't intend for it to, but that led to a whole doctrine in science called reductionism. And reductionism basically is if I can study your brain and understand what parts it's made from, and get you down to a neuron, so I can reduce you down to the parts of your brain. Then I can determine how you're going to be. And so this idea was that once we understood what a neuron did, that the neurons therefore are the prime part of the brain that generates the electrical activity of what the brain does. Then that must mean that consciousness and our sense of self and awareness and decisions and free will and all that stuff must just be generated by the activity of neurons, and we must therefore just kind of be our brains, and whatever our brain is like, that's how we're going to be like. And at the same time, so that doctrine really took hold in neuroscience and all of science, really, reductionism, determinism, and that's all kind of under the heading of this materialist idea where you're just pieces of stuff that got made and you don't have any real purpose or meaning, and that leads to the idea that you don't have free will because your neurons generate everything, right? So anyway, so here we are 300 years later, and in the 20th century, guys like Heisenberg and Einstein and all those guys figured out that Newton's math that explains the universe doesn't work very well when you get down to subatomic particles, and they came up with what they call quantum physics. And I'm giving you 300 years in about 2 minutes. So quantum physics basically says that the way you interact with material changes the way the material behaves. And so they figured that out, that the observer has an effect on the outcome of an experiment. And so if you then understand that your brain is made up of molecules, not just neurons, but their component parts are molecules, and you understand that the behavior of molecules is determined by the mathematics of quantum physics, then you have to understand that the whole thing we thought of, once we understood the cell, we would understand the organism. So that once we understand your brain, we'll understand John, and we can predict what happens to John. Now we know that when you interact with those neurons, that you change their behavior. And so that, long story short, to say this, we also thought for years, until about 1999, that the brain was relatively fixed at birth, that you pretty much didn't make new cells at all until, after about 2 years old, your brain was pretty much fully formed. And so therefore, as you said, you could drink yourself into oblivion, but you can't make new brain cells. And we also thought that whatever happened to your brain could create irreversible damage that couldn't be, because the brain didn't make new neurons, that basically you could create a situation where it could only get worse from here. So whatever you're like now, you're going to get worse than that in the future. And so along about 1999, somebody discovered that the brain actually does make new cells. So they figured out this process of what they call neurogenesis is actually happening in all of our brains at the same time every day. Wow. Not to the same extent that skin cells regenerate or liver cells regenerate, but your brain does make new neurons. Then in the early 2000s, with the advent of functional imaging, as I talked about earlier, we figured out that the brain not only grows new cells, but also can, in real time, and does, make new connections between those cells. So constantly, rather than this fixed organ that generates your sense of consciousness, now we know from quantum physics that consciousness and brain structure are not the same thing, because you think about something and your brain changes rather than the other way around. And now we know that your brain is making new cells, and that the connections between those cells can be, not just can be, are being severed and remade all the time. So that means your brain is not this static organ. It's a dynamic, actively changing structure that happens to be renewing itself all the time, which is what the Bible said a long time ago. Yes. Renew every morning, right? So, okay. So all that to say this. Now we know that when you think about something, you have tremendous creative power over what those new neurons and what new connections are making between them do. And so the default, this is the problem, the default state is that your cells will continue to rewire in the way they always have unless you make them do something different by different thinking. And so basically, if you keep thinking the way you've always thought, you're going to keep getting the same brain you've always had, because you'll make a new neuron, you'll sever a connection to an old one, and you'll make a new connection to the new one in exactly the same way that it was before. But if you change how you think, you will change what your brain does. And that's why you can stop drinking. And that's why you can find hope again. It's why you can become a hopeful person instead of a cynical person. It's why you can get up off the couch, because you literally can do surgery on your own brain by changing how you think. And that's the nutshell version. But the hope that lies there, John, is that you're not just your brain, and you're not stuck with the brain that you have. You can change both of those things, and you are changing them every second of every day of your entire life. So the question that remains for us then is, are you going to make those changes come under your own control, and are you going to make them work for you, or are you going to accept the default state and let them continue to work against you?
You kind of alluded to this, but I've heard you, or I've seen you write about this stuff, but maybe just go a little deeper into the idea of how fascinating it is how this idea, this concept is really rooted. I mean, the Bible talks about it, right? Absolutely. It's in Scripture.
So the impetus Scripture is 2 Corinthians 10:5. Take every thought captive. It sounds impossible because you have 80, maybe somewhere between 8,000 and 60 to 80,000 thoughts every day. We know that 80% of them are negative, and the overwhelming majority of them are false. So not every thought you think is true. not even close to every thought you think is true. And there's a whole backstory. We need to have another episode of why that happens. But my new book's going to talk about that. But the idea is most of the things that pop into your head are not true. And we have this voice in our head that we hear that we think we're supposed to react to because it's us. But it's generally brain messages that are deceptive. And the other thing is a large portion of what happens in your head is related to things that you feel. And it turns out that feelings aren't facts. They're chemical events in your brain. So you have these neurotransmitters and memories that get repackaged as thoughts that you think are your thoughts, but they're really just brain messages. And the purpose of them mostly is to keep you alive, to say, hey, last time we experienced this set of inputs from the environment or remembered something or felt something, you told us to open a bottle and drink. Is that what you want us to do this time? And you don't really think about it because you've automated that behavior. So before you know it, you're doing that thing again because you've engaged a brain habit that's been wired in over a long period of time. But if you choose to think a different thought, you can sever that and say, no, I don't want you to drink this time. We're changing that. We're doing something different. And it's going to take a long time to wire that in. But you can wire in a new pathway over 21 days or so. And then by persisting in that, you engage something called Hebb's Law, which is where we talk about neurons that fire together, wire together. So the more you make a behavior happen over and over, the more ingrained it becomes, and it starts to become a process that gets repeated with less mental input. And before you know it, you've got a habit that's helping you and not hurting you, right? And so you've built a new brain for yourself by willful application of this neuroplasticity that works for you. And so the scripture says, take every thought captive. So if you put a little space between what you think and what you do, and most of us kind of smash them together, we react instead of respond. So if you can just discipline yourself to put a little bit of space in there to say, let me just take that thought captive. And in my work as a brain surgeon, I like to couch everything in surgical terms. So I call it biopsying your thought. Like grab a thought, look at it, interrogate it. Is it true? Is it necessary for me to think about? Is it compassionate? Is it helpful? Is it going to harm somebody else, including me, if I use this thought? And if it's not true, I don't have to react to it. I can just discard it and transplant a healthier thought there. So that little space, is it this thought real? Is it true? Do I need to react to it? That'll give you that moment to decide how you're going to respond instead of react. And then you can engage the neuroplasticity to work for you. So the first verse, 2 Corinthians 10:5, take every thought captive. The second one, the super short version, Cliff's Note version, is Romans 12, verse 2. Don't be conformed anymore to the way the world wants you to think, to the way you're supposed to react, to the way your family taught you to behave. Don't be conformed to that. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So he's telling you a little coded message. You have the ability to renew your mind. You have the tools in place to change your brain structurally, and it will transform your life if you will do that. So that's the short version. The long version is Philippians 4 and Ephesians 4, where they get into the idea of if you want to stop being anxious, be grateful instead. Paul says. And it turns out that your hippocampus is like a switch. So when you feel anxiety, if you don't switch away from it, you're going to engage your sympathetic nervous system. You're going to make cortisol. You're going to get stressed out. Your physiology is going to change, and you're going to be anxious. But the hippocampus, if you say, maybe I don't want to be anxious right now, maybe I'm going to find some way to think about something for which I'm grateful, your hippocampus will switch, and that input will go, instead of towards amygdala, it will go towards frontal lobe, which is executive control, and your ability to say, wait a minute, I can think of a better solution to this than opening a bottle. I can think of a better way to handle this than going to despair. I can manage this by getting my brain engaged and not my amygdala, right? So that's what Philippians 4 says. And it turns out from the neuroscience that it's true. You can't actually be anxious and thankful at the same time. You can be one or the other, but you can't be both. And so you can choose to find something to be grateful for. Well, somebody's going to say, my kid died. I've had a terrible life. What in the world do I have to be thankful for? And you can say, well, be thankful that you have the ability to draw a breath and send that oxygen to either your amygdala or to your frontal lobe. And you can decide right in this moment, I'll feel better if I choose frontal engagement and rational, reasonable response. And I'm thankful for that ability. And then once you get that one under your belt, then you can find a million other things that you can be thankful for. And that gratitude, anxiety shift is real. You can't be both at the same time. So you can choose, again, you have the choice of what you think about. You can choose gratitude over anxiety. The long passage that relates to it is Ephesians 4. And the punchline of Ephesians 4 is Paul says that he wants us to be made new in the attitudes of our minds. And then he contrasts that with what Gentiles do. And in his verbiage there, we can say Gentiles are people that don't know God, basically. Right. So he says, I demand this. If you hear Paul yelling at you, I demand this, that you no longer live as the Gentiles do, who are lost in the futility of their thinking. Mm. And so it turns out bad thinking isn't a problem for our lives. It's the problem for our lives. Mm. And it relates to, if you want to break down what the problem with alcoholism is, break down what the problem with pornography is, break down what the problem with lust or theft or any other type of vice or problem that you have, it all starts with what you're thinking about, doesn't it? I mean, every problem, that's what Paul says. They are lost because they got their thinking wrong. So if you get your thinking right, you have a better chance of not being lost and not being hosed, not being recidivism, not having all these problems resurge. And so that's the whole ball of wax is you learn how to get your thinking under control, you will learn how to get your life under control.
Oh, Dr. Lee. Oh, so, and you know, I'm in seminary right now, and I'm studying, going through a section in my New Testament class about, in my hermeneutics class about, you know, inerrancy of Scripture, God breathed, and whatnot, and just what you just shared in that last few minutes. It's just like, it's such an example, right? Like, you know, first century, they obviously didn't know what we know about the brain.
Yeah.
Right. And yet, what Paul is talking about now, thousands of years later, is confirmed by what you know about studying the brain, and what you know just since the turn of the century.
Yep.
Right. Like, you know, I talked about that article or whatever I read. I mean, that was old science, right?
Yep.
That stuck with me, right? It's like this is new science in the last 20-something years.
That's right.
And so I just think it's so cool that new science is going back and confirming what Paul has said. And there's so much more we could talk about. You alluded to a new book, and I'd love for you to just kind of give a preview of self-brain surgery.
Sure. So the new book is not going to be out for another year. It comes out in February 26 from Tyndale. But it's the Handbook of Self-Brain Surgery, and we're going to break down all this stuff that we've been talking about. I give you 15 what we call self-brain surgery operations. So there's how are you going to handle anxiety, grief, depression, substance abuse, the 15 common things that we all deal with. I'll give you what we call the 10 commandments of self-brain surgery, which are all my best principles of neuroscience applied to Scripture and how we can use them to flourish and find abundance in our lives. And so I'm excited about that. And we'll be talking a lot about that on my podcast and stuff. And you're going to be on my podcast when your book comes out. So we'll have a good conversation about that. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lee. It really is truly an honor to know you and to have you just as a resource and be able to talk about these things. And you are truly a humble man. And I think I'm not gonna completely which I say spill the beans, but you know, I know there's also some exciting things in the works where people might be seeing more of your work in a different format, and I'll just leave it at that.
We hope so. Yeah.
And so my point is, you're about to, like, as popular as you are now, like there's a chance you're going to blow up even bigger. And then I'm going to say, hey, go back to the episode where the famous Dr. Lee Warren talked about self-brain surgery. So
wow.
We love you. We're gonna have you on again for sure. And so
Absolutely.
Thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for the work that you're doing. I you know, God's plan is perfect, but there are times where I'm like, if I only would have known this a little sooner, right? And so that's part of why I want to do this podcast, is hopefully that there's people out there who are not, you know, who are hearing this a little earlier in their alcohol use disorder spectrum journey, that don't believe the lies. And I think that's so fascinating. You talk about, you know, how many of the lies that we believe, the things that aren't true, that are constantly being accosted at us or thrown at us. So I wish that I would have heard this, and so hopefully people can hear this. So we love you. Thank you so much. Can't wait for your next work to come out. If people want to follow you, because you also post, I mean, you're posting regularly about this stuff, where should they go?
So we have drleewarren.substack.com as my Substack. I have the Dr. Lee Warren podcast, which is everywhere podcasts are found. And then on the Substack, you can get my newsletter that comes out every week, Self-Brain Surgery. So easy to find online. There is another Dr. Lee Warren. He's not me. You'll see the difference if you find him. So if he doesn't look like me, it's not me. So
And we'll put a
we
link.
love you. We're grateful for you, my friend.
Thank you. We'll talk soon.
Okay, God bless.
What a fascinating guy, right? I mean, hopefully you have come to appreciate him just in that little bit of time as much as I have, as I've gotten to know him over the last year. Just a fun story about Lee. So there was a time where me and some other friends and people that I've worked with in the addiction recovery space, we're kicking around the idea of doing a conference this fall about faith and addiction. And we had gotten, a little bit down the road, and I gotten to the point where I wanted to invite some friends in to be a part of it, to help, get the word out and be featured. And I reached out to Lee, and I think I just told Lee mostly that that we were going to do it, but details weren't, finalized. And he immediately came up with people that he knew, ideas for how to integrate, call in some favors. And before he even knew it, he had a private concert booked with an incredible person. And I was like, oh my gosh, Lee, you're awesome. And that's just how he is. He is so giving. His next book, I'm telling you, is going to blow up. And I think you're going to be able to say, well, I heard him on the Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic podcast, when he's on Good Morning America and Joe Rogan and all those places. So you heard it here first. But listen, he actually has a more successful podcast than I could ever imagine. And his weekly newsletter is incredible. So please go sign up for that Self-Brain Surgery newsletter and make sure to pre-order the book when it comes out. Love you all. Just want to say thank you again to my audio partner, Life Audio. You can go to lifeaudio.com and listen to other great podcasts like this one. But I have friends who have podcasts. I've brought people into the Life Audio network, right? So when I say I love these people and they've been great and I'm so thankful, I've put my recommendations where my mouth is and brought other people into this network because I believe in what they're doing and they're really good people. So go check out the other podcasts on lifeaudio.com. We will see you back here next week for another episode of Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic.